If you've ever tangled with a homeowners association or had a neighbor who thought they ruled the entire block, stick around. Karen decides to bring her overbearing rules down on a new homeowner. She's totally unaware that her target is a federal agent. Yes, you read that right, a federal agent. Trust me, it all goes downhill for Karen in spectacular fashion. I moved into the Everglades Lake community, ironically named, since there's neither a lake nor an Everglade in sight, at the start of last year. The place looked charming enough. Rows of neat, single-story houses from the late 1970s, broad driveways, and nicely tended lawns. My real estate agent assured me that the HOA was mild. The contract only mentioned lawn upkeep, trash can placement, and parking guidelines. It seemed standard for an HOA. After renting apartments for years, I decided that dealing with a mild HOA would be manageable. That was before I discovered that the word mild was a cruel understatement of what I would experience. It wasn't until move-in day that I first heard Karen's name. The moving truck had barely backed in my driveway when a neighbor sidled over to introduce himself. If you're new, you'll want to keep an eye out for Karen. She's head of the HOA, and I'm afraid she can be a handful. He tried to phrase it politely, but I could see his shoulders tense even as he said her name. It was as if just mentioning her might invite misfortune. I live 2 doors down, by the way, he added quickly. I'm James. Let me know if you need a hand. James seemed like a decent guy, and I brushed off his warning with a laugh. How bad could one woman be? I was in my early 50s, looking to settle into a quieter life. I'd spent my youth traveling for work, and after seeing the world, I was ready to relax with neighbors who might occasionally wave hello. I certainly didn't expect to get tangled up in a property dispute. Even more, I didn't expect to have to reveal my line of work in order to defend my own home. Within an hour of James leaving, I got my first direct contact with Karen. She must have been watching from behind her curtains, because she arrived precisely when I had boxes scattered on the lawn. She was impeccably dressed for someone just dropping in on a neighbor, heels, a navy blazer, and a stack of papers in her hand. "Hello," she said, flashing an artificial smile. "I'm Karen, the HOA chairwoman here at Everglades Lake." She pronounced the community name like it was a fancy gated estate, not a suburban sprawl of ranch-style houses. "I see you're moving in. You must be Ms. Lane." I nodded. She immediately started listing the HOA guidelines in a voice loud enough for half the block to hear. No welcome casserole, no friendly chit-chat about the neighborhood, just a recitation of rules. "We have a strict architectural code," she said, flipping through the pages. "Only certain paint colors are permitted for front doors. Trash bins must be removed from the curb by 10 a.m. the day after pickup. Lawn length must not exceed." She paused to squint at a minuscule line, 3.5 inches. "We do monthly inspections to ensure compliance." It wasn't my first time dealing with a Type A personality. In my job, thoroughness and detail-oriented thinking were second nature, so I actually kind of respected the thoroughness. But Karen's tone gave away her real motive. She relished power. She clearly expected me to nod eagerly, apologize for any minor infraction, and seek her approval. I simply offered a polite smile. "I'll do my best to follow these guidelines," I said. She gave a curt nod. "I certainly hope so. You'll find I don't tolerate disorder. After all, this community has standards." With that, she turned on her heel and marched off. No further pleasantries. No, welcome to the neighborhood. Just rules and subtle threats. Right then, I understood why James gave me the heads up. Despite the frosty introduction, I intended to mind my own business. My new home had good bones, but needed a few repairs and updates. In the months that followed, I dedicated my weekends to painting, upgrading the windows, and redoing the landscaping. The funny part is, I'd actually planned to follow every single HOA rule anyway, because I prefer order myself. But Karen found ways to nitpick things that weren't even in the bylaws. She complained that my work truck was parked too far to the left in my driveway, that the color of my newly planted begonias clashed with the community aesthetic, and that I had to use a certain brand of fertilizer to maintain uniform grass texture. At first, I tried to be diplomatic. Maybe she was just trying to uphold neighborhood quality. However, her complaints became more intrusive. She'd barge onto my property unannounced, snapping photos of my progress. And every time, she'd threaten me with official action from the HOA board. I knew from talking to other neighbors that Karen ran the board like her personal kingdom. They rarely voted on anything. They just nodded along with whatever she said, probably out of fear or exhaustion. Little did she know, I was no stranger to exhaustive regulations or dealing with high-stakes bureaucracy. My job as a federal agent in the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General, to be precise, had me investigating housing fraud, property scams, and illegal construction schemes for over 20 years. I negotiated with con artists and cornered unscrupulous real estate developers on a national scale. But I never wanted to parade my job title around. It usually complicates relationships with neighbors. Still, I got the sense that Karen was itching to test my limits. And one piece of advice I learned during countless investigations is, never reveal your cards unless you have to. So, I let her continue believing I was some hapless homeowner who wouldn't push back. What I didn't expect was that Karen would escalate matters from nitpicking to something 1,000 times worse, something that would trigger an investigation far bigger than she could ever imagine. When spring arrived, I decided to build a small patio extension behind the house. A modest project, really. According to the HOA's own guidelines, any new structures visible from the street or shared property lines required approval. But my patio wasn't visible to the street, nor did it extend into any shared space. I was certain I didn't need special permission. Still, Karen roamed the neighborhood like a hawk, so I suspected she'd be suspicious of any construction noises. Sure enough, the day I broke ground for the extension, Karen appeared at my doorstep with a clipboard. I received complaints about a major construction project you're undertaking, she announced. Her lips pursed as she tried to peer past me into the backyard. I almost laughed because it was just me digging a few post holes, but she acted like I was building a skyscraper. I'll need to see your permits and your board approval form, she demanded. I don't need board approval for a small patio, I replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. I could tell she loathed that I wasn't intimidated by her. Section 4.3 of the HOA guideline states that if it's not visible from the street and doesn't extend into communal property, it's allowed. Karen's face flushed, but she didn't back down. I'm the one who decides if it's visible or not, she fumed. This entire community is under my jurisdiction, and I say you need a permit. If you don't cease construction immediately, we'll fine you each day you continue. I considered revealing my credentials right then. I'd encountered bullies before, but this was next-level arrogance. However, something told me Karen was more than just a busybody. She seemed to thrive on controlling others, and I was curious how far she'd go. So I decided to keep calm and collect evidence, just like I do in any of my HUD investigations. Over the next few days, I documented every encounter with her. Neighbors started coming to me, whispering their own horror stories about Karen. For instance, James told me how she once threatened to have his grandmother's wheelchair ramp removed because it didn't match the house's exterior color. Another neighbor shared that Karen once insisted on painting over a young girl's sidewalk chalk art, claiming it was graffiti. It dawned on me that Karen was using the HOA to harass people into submission, likely for her own power trip. But even that might be overshadowed by something more sinister. There were rumors of missing funds from the HOA's treasury, unexplained special assessment fees, and deals with certain contractors that didn't go through standard bidding processes. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from an older resident named Clara who lived on the corner lot. She got my number from James. Her voice trembled as she told me a series of alarming details. Karen had allegedly forced Clara to pay $2,000 in maintenance penalties last year, claiming Clara's home needed a community-chosen paint job. The money was paid directly to Karen, who never provided receipts or contracts. Clara never got the paint job either. She had no idea where her money went. That set off alarm bells in my head. HOA boards are non-profit entities. They have to keep transparent financial records. If Karen was misappropriating funds, it could be a serious legal matter. Curiosity became concern. By day, I was working on a big federal case investigating a developer who'd scammed low-income homeowners. By night, I found myself quietly compiling evidence on Karen. My training taught me to follow the money, but it also taught me not to tip off suspects prematurely. If Karen was funneling HOA funds into her personal accounts or forging documents, I needed something solid to prove it. While I was busy collecting testimonies, Karen kept pushing. She hired a security company, her nephew's startup, apparently, to patrol the streets, but really they just drove in circles at all hours. She bombarded neighbors with new fees for mundane things like having a basketball hoop out front or using holiday lights that weren't community approved. But her main obsession was me. I think she sensed I wasn't the type to cave, and it got under her skin. One night, I came home from the grocery store to find a neon orange violation notice taped to my front door. In giant letters, it read, "Final warning, unauthorized construction." According to this notice, I had two options: tear down my patio extension or face immediate structural removal by the HOA. I couldn't believe she thought she could literally remove part of my property. I looked up the relevant Florida statutes. Everglades Lake was in suburban Florida, after all, and confirmed an HOA can fine a homeowner. They can lien a property if fines aren't paid, and in some cases they can even foreclose. But physically demolishing someone's property without a court order was definitely illegal. At this point, I had to weigh my choices. I could attend the next HOA meeting, produce my carefully gathered evidence of her wrongdoing, and potentially have her ousted. But if the board was in her pocket, that might not help. Alternatively, I could quietly make a few calls to local law enforcement or my contacts at the state's Attorney General office. Yet, I hesitated. I wanted to have an airtight case, not just rumors and hearsay. The biggest question was whether Karen had the audacity to act on her bulldozer threat. The neighbors who'd faced her bullying were too afraid to stand up, so I was basically the only one challenging her. I decided to keep my eyes open and secure my property as best I could. I installed a couple of security cameras, ironically the same brand I used for stakeouts in my federal job. I even posted no trespassing signs in the backyard. Part of me hoped it would deter her from doing anything rash. But that was wishful thinking, because I didn't yet know just how far Karen was willing to go to assert her so-called authority. And let me tell you, when she finally crossed that line, it wasn't just me she ticked off, it was the entire weight of federal law enforcement waiting in the wings. The tipping point came on a muggy Saturday morning. I just finished breakfast when a cacophony of rattling machinery tore through the neighborhood. At first, I assumed it was construction on a nearby street, but the noise got louder, closer. Suddenly, James pounded on my door wide-eyed. "Karen's brought a bulldozer," he exclaimed. "You've got to come see this." Heart pounding, I rushed outside. There it was, a full-fledged bulldozer lumbering up the road, followed by Karen's nephew's so-called security team, their black SUVs crawling behind like a makeshift entourage. Neighbors spilled out onto their lawns in shock. Some filmed with their phones, while others just stared in disbelief. Karen herself was perched in front of the bulldozer, barking orders at the driver. I marched over, keeping my distance from the rumbling machine. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the engine noise. She held up a clipboard and rattled off something about enforcement actions and hazard removal. By this point, the bulldozer had nearly reached my driveway. "You were warned," she declared, her voice trembling with what I can only describe as glee. "You failed to remove unauthorized construction. Therefore, the HOA is forced to take action and demolish the non-compliant structure. We have every right to do so." She thrust her clipboard toward me, but I barely glanced at it. My focus was on the man at the bulldozer's controls, and I could see that he looked uneasy, sweat beading on his forehead, uncertain about whether he should really go through with this. I raised both hands to get his attention. "Stop," I shouted, stepping forward. "I'm telling you, you have no legal authority to demolish anything on my property. If you do this, you're committing a crime." Karen smirked. "You can threaten all you want. This entire operation is sanctioned by the community board," she crowed. "I have all the signatures, and we follow procedure. If you have a problem with it, you can take it up in court after we're done here." My heart was pounding, but I stood firm. My time as a federal agent had taught me how to handle intense confrontations, but usually I had backup. "Here," It was just me and a crowd of stunned neighbors. I turned to James, who was filming with his phone. "Keep recording," I said softly. Then it happened. Karen gave the signal, and the bulldozer lurched forward. With a metallic groan, it rolled right up to my property line. I could hear neighbors gasping. I took a deep breath, plastered on my best official voice, and reached into my wallet. "Shut it down now," I commanded, flashing my badge for the first time in public. "I'm an agent with the Office of Inspector General under HUD. You are trespassing on federally protected property." The bulldozer driver froze, confusion etched on his face. Karen's own face went beet red. She sputtered, I don't care who you are. This is my neighborhood, and you're violating our codes." She turned to her so-called security guards. "Arrest him for obstruction if he tries to stop us." Inwardly, I cursed. These guards had no real authority to arrest anyone, but they might be stupid enough to try. The tension reached a boiling point. Two of them jumped out of the SUV, scanning the scene like they were about to do something heroic. James kept his phone camera rolling, capturing every second. I whipped out my phone and quickly called the local police department, identifying myself as a federal agent. "We have an unlawful demolition in progress," I said, keeping my voice level. "Request immediate assistance." The dispatcher confirmed units were on the way. Meanwhile, Karen's bulldozer driver seemed torn. He kept looking at me, the yard, and Karen, unsure whose orders to follow. "Don't you dare listen to him," Karen shrieked. "I represent this community's best interests, and you'll be paid handsomely for today's work." Then, without warning, she marched over to the bulldozer and slammed her palm on the side of the cab. "Drive," she yelled. With a terrible roar, the bulldozer lurched forward, crossing onto my lawn. One giant scoop plowed into the base of my newly laid patio, ripping up concrete and sending debris flying. I could hardly believe it. She actually did it. She was demolishing part of my house. The driver looked terrified, but obeyed her anyway, probably for fear of not getting paid. Neighbors screamed. Some shouted for Karen to stop. James documented everything, and I could see his hands shaking, the phone's camera unsteady. Knowing the local police were en route, I ran back to the front door, taking cover from the flying concrete shards. My mind raced. Even if the police arrived this instant, damage was being done. I never seen such blatant disregard for property rights. Within minutes, though it felt like a lifetime, sirens sounded in the distance. Red and blue lights approached rapidly, and a pair of patrol cars screeched to a halt. Officers jumped out, guns not drawn, but hands at the ready, clearly thrown off by the spectacle of a bulldozer in a quiet suburban street. Karen tried to wave them over, yelling something about trespassing and HOA regulations. But the cops focused on me when I identified myself, showed them my federal credentials, and pointed to the massive piece of machinery still perched halfway across my lawn. "Shut it down immediately," one of the officers yelled at the bulldozer driver. This time, the driver didn't hesitate. He killed the engine. The officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we need you to step back. We have reports of illegal property destruction." Karen started a tirade. "I am the HOA chairwoman, and we have every right to enforce structural compliance." But the police didn't look impressed. They separated us, asking for statements. Meanwhile, the neighbors kept filming, murmuring in shock. I gave my statement, including the stack of evidence I'd gathered about Karen's past harassment. The officer nodded gravely. "We'll be sorting this out with detectives," he said. "But from what I see here, you've got grounds for charges of trespassing, vandalism, and possibly more. I want to get your full report, especially given your federal background." I caught Karen watching me from a few yards away, eyes filled with disbelief and rage. She looked like she finally realized she might have gone too far. But let's be honest, Karen had no idea just how much trouble she was truly in, because the next step was the official investigation. And let's just say that investigation opened Pandora's box on her entire operation. After the bulldozer incident, the local police roped off my property with crime scene tape, something you'd expect at a bank robbery, not a suburban patio demolition. Once they took photos and measurements, I was free to begin repairs, but the officer recommended I wait until the formal investigation was underway. "We'll need full documentation of the damage," he explained. "And if you plan to file civil or criminal charges, you'll want everything intact." Karen was escorted off the property in handcuffs, but she didn't stay in jail overnight. She posted bail quickly and was back in the neighborhood by evening, swearing up and down she was the real victim. However, she was instantly stripped of her so-called security team, who fled the scene the minute the police started asking for their business licenses. Rumor had it the bulldozer driver was also questioned about where he got the heavy machinery, apparently leased under Karen's name. The local news even caught wind of the story. Footage of a giant yellow bulldozer in front of a modest ranch house is pretty sensational. After all, while the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, I quietly initiated my own formal inquiry under the Department of Housing and Urban Development's guidelines. I'd never planned on investigating my own HOA, but Karen had given me no choice. With my credentials, I had direct lines to the State's Attorney General and the Financial Crimes Unit. I filed a report detailing the suspicious finances and intimidation tactics that neighbors had told me about. Within days, we had subpoenas for the HOA's financial records. What we uncovered was worse than I expected. Karen had been skimming from HOA dues for years, funneling them into shell accounts under her nephew's name. She slapped fines on homeowners for bogus violations and never recorded the payments officially. Instead, she pocketed the money and cooked the books to look like maintenance expenses. Meanwhile, the association's bank account was nearly empty, with a string of shady contractor fees that led back to companies owned by Karen's relatives. She was running a small-scale racket under the guise of community management, and when confronted, she used intimidation, like the bulldozer stunt, to keep people from questioning her authority. With the official investigation in full swing, Karen tried everything to salvage her reputation. She went door to door, spouting conspiracy theories that I was some kind of con artist who forged government IDs to undermine the community. No one believed her, especially after seeing her in cuffs. She held an emergency HOA meeting, inviting only her closest allies, but word got out anyway. Even her allies started to realize the sinking ship they were on. One by one, they distanced themselves, claiming they had no idea about her illegal actions. Meanwhile, I coordinated with local prosecutors and turned over every scrap of evidence, financial statements, bank transactions, and especially the video footage of the bulldozer destroying part of my patio. The neighbors who'd been intimidated came forward with testimonies. Clara, the older resident who'd paid thousands for a fake paint job, provided canceled checks made out directly to Karen. James had hours of footage from his phone, capturing Karen's threatening rants. By the time the DA's office pieced it all together, it was clear Karen was looking at a long list of felony charges: fraud, embezzlement, property destruction, and more. My only regret was the damage to my home, but ironically that made the case against her even stronger. Karen tried to settle out of court, offering to pay for the repairs if I dropped the charges. But it was too late. The bulldozer incident had sealed her fate. The state had enough evidence to prosecute without me backing down. I wasn't about to let a con artist like that escape justice, especially knowing she'd continue scamming others if left unchecked. On the day of the preliminary hearing, Karen showed up with a high-priced attorney, all bluster and sneers. But as soon as the judge began reviewing the evidence, a DVD of the bulldozer footage, reams of bank statements, and testimonies from at least a dozen residents, the attorney's bravado fizzled. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of purple when she realized the judge wasn't buying her HOA compliance excuse. The judge even said, "I've never seen a case where an HOA official used a bulldozer to enforce a violation. This is a flagrant abuse of power." By the end of the hearing, Karen was charged on multiple counts, bail set even higher, and her passport was confiscated. A few months later, the trial began. It didn't last long. Faced with a mountain of evidence, Karen's attorney advised her to plead guilty to several felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She ended up with a couple of years behind bars, plus hefty restitution to the community. The court ordered her to repay every cent she stole, plus damages for demolished property, mine included. James told me that after sentencing, Karen looked like a deflated balloon, all that arrogance replaced by sheer panic. In the aftermath, the Everglades Lake HOA underwent a complete overhaul. A new board was elected. Turns out most neighbors were more than happy to serve once Karen was gone. They revised outdated rules, introduced transparency measures like public financial ledgers, and swore never to let a tyrant run unopposed again. When I finally completed the repairs on my patio, the new HOA president stopped by with a gift basket and a genuine apology for what I'd gone through. I laughed and said, "At least now we know how to spot a corrupt official, right?" As for me, I continue my work with HUD, but I'll never look at an HOA the same way again. The neighborhood settled into a quieter existence, with fewer petty squabbles and more cooperation. Clara finally got her house painted, by a reputable contractor this time, and the neighbors seemed closer, bonded by the collective shock of the bulldozer fiasco, as folks called it. Sometimes I still catch people glancing at my ID badge when they visit, a mixture of relief and lingering awe in their eyes. I guess it's not every day you discover your quiet neighbor is a federal agent who busts community-level corruption. If there's one silver lining, it's that the entire community learned an important lesson. No one is above the law, even if they happen to run your local HOA. And if you're going to pick a fight with someone's property rights, you'd better make sure they don't have the power to unravel your entire scheme. Because if you push too far, like bringing a bulldozer onto someone's lawn, you might just bulldoze your own future in the process.